This is the Cedar Creek Church Living It Out podcast, a midweek reminder where we discuss key takeaways and principles from the weekend message to help you live out the truth that you matter.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Living It Out podcast, a weekly podcast to remind you that you matter and to help you live out that truth throughout the week. My name is Casey, and I'm your host today. I'm here alongside of Marna and Ben, and we're pumped to be here with you guys. This past weekend, we jumped into a brand new series called I Need a Miracle, which was a lot of fun. Ben kicked things off for us. But guys, I got a question for you. What comes to mind when you hear the word miracle?
Man, miracle. I think one of the things that comes to mind is the Miracle on Ice.
That's what I was thinking. The movie called Miracle.
I think we celebrated that 2 weeks ago. And
was it the anniversary of it?
It was
I
the
think
anniversary.
It was like 25.
What, 80? 1980?
But
20
yeah,
years.
you're right.
We'll get a calculator. We'll figure it out later.
Or 40 years. Yeah, the 40-year anniversary.
Oh, okay.
Which is crazy
Wow.
to think about. I
Yeah,
was
1980,
I was a little boy when that happened.
I wasn't born.
Something that happened, like just people thought, no way can a group of young collegiate athletes beat a professional team from
Russians.
From Russia.
Especially, right.
Especially the Russians.
So that comes to mind. One of the things, I think another thing that comes to mind is like a healing. Someone who has something, a sickness, or they can't walk or whatever, and then all of a sudden someone comes up to them, lays hands on them, and boom.
They're fine.
They're fine.
There you go. Miracle. I agree. Marna, any other thoughts?
I feel like the pendulum swings from wishes to
that's a great point.
like a now I can't even find a different word.
It's hard to define the word without using the word, right?
Some supernatural something that steps in that is unexplainable.
Yeah.
So.
Well, when you look up the word miracle in the Webster's dictionary, I don't have a word for word definition in front of me, but it uses that divine intervention in the everyday to give you an outcome that you weren't expecting, which is essentially what a miracle is. Mm-hmm. And I think we've talked about this a little bit, but the word miracle, and I think even this series, there is this connotation that miracles have to be these crazy shifts, typically in the medical field, whether it's cancer or some diagnosis, kind of like you mentioned, Ben. And that's usually where our brains go when we think of miracles.
I know. I was saying it's something physical.
Yeah.
Like something, a physical healing, or there's something tangible in some of what I always think of, or even the stories that you see that make the news, or I mean, there's still movies that are happening today on some of those things. But there's something physical as an outcome almost. Like I'm now well, or I'm now living.
There's something to see. Yeah.
There is something to see.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So as we dive into the series, obviously we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about miracles that happen. We're going to talk about miracles that Jesus performed. But we're also going to talk about what does it look like for the everyday person to experience that? Because the reality is we all experience miracles really every single day in a way. And so we're going to have a little bit of a conversation around that right now. So thanks for tuning in. We're excited to dive into that. And we've said it this way too. Miracles come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're big and sometimes they're small, but the miracles still happen every single day. So for you guys, I would love for you to kind of dive into what Ben talked about this weekend. Let's kind of review his bottom line, review some of that content really quick for people listening.
Yeah. So Ben taught out of John 2 this weekend, and really I think this in so many ways lends itself to what a miracle is, and that God can convert a mess into a display of goodness. And as he unpacked John 2, that really talks about when Jesus goes to a wedding, which was a very social affair in his day, as much as it is still today, depending on I guess your budget and that sort of thing. But it's really that miracle that's recorded as he's at this wedding. He's with family, he's with friends, and he converts water into wine. So that's really that basis for it.
Right. And then they run out of wine, which I know we talked about. Like, it was like an embarrassment.
That's a big deal.
Back then,
it's a big deal.
You don't run out of food, and you don't run out of wine.
And if you're Italian and you're listening, this was my experience at least. My mom ordered way too much alcohol and wine for our wedding because she just really didn't want to run out. Like even when we go over there for dinner, she makes food enough for 12 people. There's 4 of us sitting around the table.
Right.
So there is this cultural piece that is like, don't run out. You serve your guests well. You make sure everybody has enough. And when you're unable to do that, you said it, Ben, it can be an embarrassment to a certain extent.
I think even you talking about that, there's so much in this story that even as you were saying that, I thought this is so much about grace, but you know, it never runs out. It's always available.
That's good.
It's all of that. But I think there is so much significance in this story, and particularly at the point that Jesus is in his ministry as well. I mean, he's still relatively, I'll quote unquote, new on the scene.
Sure.
You know, and that sort of piece of now he starts to demonstrate God's goodness in some ways that people are either celebrating or very confused by.
This is a pivotal moment in Jesus' ministry.
Yeah,
that's very true. So I love that bottom line. God can convert a mess into a display of goodness. Ben got a little rhymey there too. That's good. Kind of, but it rolls off the tongue well. Turning water into wine, again, a little bit of an embarrassment for this family. And then Mary, the mother of Jesus, approaches Jesus and says, hey, this happened. And Jesus' response is kind of unique. Talk through that a little bit. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think one thing with that is Mary was ready to share the mess that she found herself
that's
in.
Good.
Like the family is run out of wine, and she didn't just keep it to herself. They didn't like go hush hush, like they went and told Jesus, like, "Hey, we're out of wine, and we're in a mess." Like just flat out told him, and then Jesus was really able to step into it and said, you know, what I'm not going to do anything about it, or what do you want me to do about it? But ultimately, Mary came to the place where she told the servants, do whatever he says. And just that place of trust.
Mary really displays that. And even as you say that, it's kind of like coming to my mind. She displays this openness, this like, hey, we're going to figure it out, but it's really messy. That's good. That's really good. Marna, any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Ben captured it well. And just, again, the sort of the dynamics of just remember, there's a lot of people there.
Totally.
So this is not a small affair of 5 people that she turns to him. I mean, this in many ways would define the family for
generations
potentially. So I think that's an important piece too, is that again, in identity and defining. So
well, we're going to walk through a little bit of Ben's message here and give some context and hopefully some practical pieces for you guys to live out as we walk through it. And the first part is really like, I guess I want to say this too. This is not a formula to miracles happening in your life, right? Because this doesn't mean follow these 3 steps and you're going to be cured from whatever it may be. We talked off camera and off mic a little bit, but this idea that the little miracles are the little things that we experience every single day. In fact, even the fact that we can receive grace from God and extend it to other people, that's a miracle within itself. And so as we go through these points, I just think it's really important. If you haven't listened to the message yet, go back and listen to it. But just the lens in which we look at this content, I think is really important to say. It's not going to guarantee that you are going to experience some crazy big miracle in your life.
And I think it's really back to that bottom line, that it's about converting a mess into a display of goodness. And that's the heart of all of this, is that we have experienced a miracle. So
and that can happen in all shapes and sizes, just like we said earlier, right? Turning that mess into goodness. So the first kind of step, if you will, to experiencing miracles and just even acknowledging and seeing them is to trust. God still does miracles today, like we talked about earlier, and it gives us this opportunity to know God. What does that look like? I mean, we talk about trusting God a lot, and it is this kind of nuanced idea, because it's not like you can actually just take a step and trust. You have to. It's a little different, right? Like
speaking of something you can't see.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So let's talk to this idea of, first we have to trust. What am I trusting Him with, and how do I do that?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit already, as far as like Mary identified that she was in a mess, and she brought it to Jesus. And I think that's a huge part of trust, is just the surrendering of realizing you need to give it up to God. And a lot of times we want to keep control, or we want to know all the details or figure out the next step. And almost we want to be the miracle maker to get ourselves out of a mess, right? As opposed to really giving up control of it and surrender to Jesus.
Yeah, I think there is that sort of, there's got to be something I can do. When I have found myself in these situations where somebody is really sick or something tragic has happened, and you would do anything to change the details of that one moment, I think there's so much in that is you're filled with hurt, and there's regret, and there's guilt over I could have done something different here, and so now on the back end, can I somehow make it better here?
Right.
And so I think you're right that so much of it is understanding that trusting God is knowing who He is and recognizing that He steps into all of that mess. When that's still so tough, I think, sometimes, because our first response is not, or mine, I'll speak for me personally,
I would agree.
Is not always in that space. I can get there faster now. I would say my on-ramp is shorter to, hey, I've got to surrender this. But for many years, it was a very long ramp before I got to that point.
It's a great point. It's a great point. So to kind of sum up your guys' thoughts, to identify whether it's a physical struggle or it's a emotional, spiritual struggle you're experiencing in your life, the first thing you got to do to experience a miracle is to trust, to surrender, to let it go, just like Mary does, right? She acknowledges to Jesus, hey, this is a problem. This isn't something that I want to be experiencing right now in my life.
Yeah.
It's so important to do. And I think sometimes we maybe skip that step or overlook that step or not even think that's a step in itself because we're ready to try and solve the problem. Like you said, Ben, we take it into our own hands.
I just want to fix it.
Yeah.
I just want to fix it.
So we feel that guilt, that shame, that fear, we feel all of those things. And so we try to tackle the mess, and the reality is we can't, because like Ben said, we're not the miracle worker. That's not how this works, right? We have to surrender it, trust that God is the miracle worker, and He's the one to work that miracle in a way that we can't. So
yeah. Well,
so
I think it's just also that trust piece is that the miracle is that we get to know Him. Yeah. And that's, I would say, been a fairly recent sort of way for me to think about, and maybe it's just taking it for granted or having been, on this journey for a while, but I think that some of it too is recognizing, like, we get to know the God of the universe. What? Yeah. Like that alone, the fact that we can come before Him in the ways that we do, and some of those things, I think. So that is so much about miracles and really pointing to Him and looking for His goodness in the middle of the mess and trusting that there is His goodness there. It will be displayed, is so much about knowing who He is. Yeah.
And in trusting, you experience more of who God is. You learn more about Him, even in that, again, we say small step, but it's probably one of the hardest. It's almost like the initial turn, right? Yes. It's like you got to turn from you trying to control it all to try and make a miracle out of it, to just say, you know what, God, this is in your hands and I'm surrendering it to you. Yep. That's great. So moving on from that, so we trust, and then the idea is that we follow. Ben shared this week, as we follow, we take a next step in the process of grace. Let's talk through that a little bit. Where does grace come into play with miracles? How do those two ideas tie together?
Yeah, when I think of the trust and the follow, they're so connected, right? Yeah. And like even thinking of the story of Jesus turning the water into wine, like He was giving steps for the servants to follow. Like, go fill this vat of, these giant jars up with water, and go do this.
Can you imagine at that point they're like,
yeah, they got to.
I mean, that's why Mary's like, do what He says.
Yeah, right.
They're like, those are heavy. Yeah. I'm not doing that. Like, I mean, at any point, right?
Yeah, they had to be scratching their heads thinking, what is this guy doing? And through it all, they trusted, but they followed step by step as well. And I think that's what we're invited to do, is as we trust God with the mess we're in, and we do certain things to follow, we know Him better. We're able to know Him better, and really the miracle that's happening isn't just the miracle of the end result that we want. There's miracles happening along the way in our own lives, and we're becoming different people as a result of it.
I think that's what, just even as we talked about trust, when you look at follow, grace in and of itself is a miracle. It's a miracle that we get to experience it, that we get to receive that from Him, that there's not anything that we do day to day or at any single one point that changes what grace does in our life. Yeah. It's the most consistent miracle that we can access and experience every single day that I think in a lot of ways I take for granted more often than I'd like. I mean, that's sort of what emerged for me out of this was we get to experience that every single day.
But our tendency is to try. Is to fix it. Yeah. And then when we turn and trust, we start to follow, and we almost fall into, this is a Hillsong song, but the rhythm of that grace, right? Like the rhythm of that over and over again of saying, God, I'm not enough, but you are. Yeah. And you're going to help me through this, and you're going to teach me something. You're going to work a miracle in me, and then hopefully through me in a way that I did not expect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's even in some of the points that Ben talked about in that section where as it's like God converts our steps of trust into miraculous results.
Yeah.
And again, it's not always the physicalness of what we've been praying for, but it's the potentially what's happening in us or relationally between people, that nothing is beyond him.
Yeah.
And so I just think that process of grace is the miracle.
Why do you think we miss that? Why do we miss that process? Because I think for a lot of us, I experience this. Like I might trust, and then like I miss the process of following sometimes, and I'm just kind of expecting a miracle to happen because I gave it to God. Now what? Right? Like I gave it to him, but nothing's happening. I'm continuing to pray. I'm continuing to ask, and I'm not seeing a miracle happen. But I'm missing, right? I'm missing all of the little miracles along the way.
Yeah, I think that's so much perspective too, right? I mean, this is where sometimes, we have a ton of fun when we look back over the weekend series and how things start to how quite honestly God starts to build a story for us throughout the year. And when I think about if you were with us when Ben did that perspective exercise of I might be able to see this one piece of it, but I can't see the whole, or this part might be right, but I can't see it completely. And there is so much maturing and growing happening in us in those moments that I think when you ask me, why don't we follow? It's because we're still immature. We're still growing. Yeah. We're still trying to figure it out. Like most of the time I feel like a toddler that's like tipping this way and that way. And he's like, not, So I think the grace for ourselves in that process is really important too.
Yeah, I think just becoming impatient, not getting to where the end result that we want right away.
We live in a culture that just wants immediate gratification right away.
Yeah, I think Ben talked about the Kool-Aid man busting through the wall saying, here's the miracle. Yeah. And the reality is a lot of times it's taking a lot longer. So perseverance of continuing to daily surrender and take those steps is providing miracles all the way through.
So maybe that's another flaw in our view of what miracles are, is we see them as this instant moment of change, when in reality, like, miracle is a process. Maybe
I think a lot of it is. I mean, certainly the process of if the ultimate miracle is knowing him and receiving grace, right? That's a lifelong process.
Yeah, that's not a one-time thing.
That is not a one-time.
So even as we give that example earlier of like turning and trusting, it's like, no, you're consistently turning, like, because you're gonna find yourself trying again every day. And so you got to remind yourself.
Like I said, the on-ramp was gigantic for me, and probably still is in some parts that
relative to how it used to be, right?
Right, yeah.
That's great. So we trust, we follow, because again, you said earlier that the miracle God wants to do in you may be greater than the miracle he wants to do for you. Yeah. And so being really just having that perspective and being introspective while we're trusting and while we're following, like, what else is God doing in my life right now? Because maybe it's a medical diagnosis you're praying for and you're trusting God with it.
That's right.
There's a lot of little things within that, whether that's interactions with doctors. And I even think off the top of my head, you remember Luke Shortridge when his oldest son was born?
Yes.
They went through a lot of that, but they trusted God, and what they did was they experienced God's miracles in ways that they would have never expected to experience before.
Yeah, today's Living It Out talked about that.
Lori White. Yeah, Lori shared a little bit about that, how her husband was diagnosed with cancer, and the miracle they wanted was for him to be cured. And eventually he did fight it, which was great, but there were a bunch of little miracles throughout the way that when you shift your perspective and you continue to follow, you see them, which is just so good.
Yeah, I think you talked about this, Ben, of living with an expectancy of, maybe not here, this might have been off mic, but I love that, of stepping into that piece of it.
Yeah, I think Ben described or defined celebrate was the kind of the last thing that we need to do in order to know God through the miracles that he's making, and that's to anticipate God's grace and then to enjoy it. And a lot of times we might lose hope or lose perseverance and stop going through those steps, but when we anticipate that God's working a miracle here, whether I see it or not, that allows us to celebrate throughout the whole entire process as well.
All right, I'm going to give a song drop right now because I can't keep thinking of the lyrics to the song Waymaker. It's so good. And it's got the line in it. It says, even when I can't see it, you're working. And I think that's such a good line. So pause right now. Go to Spotify, Apple Music. Shameless plug from Casey.
I love it.
And go listen to Waymaker. It's a very good song. And it speaks that truth. Literally what you just said, it speaks that. So I think that's super, that's just great.
And I think it's also okay if you're in those moments where you're not feeling like that, where it does feel hopeless, where you are incredibly frustrated and overwhelmed. And I think as long as you just don't stay there. So that's the biggest piece for me, I think, out of this, is that we're going to have those moments.
Yes.
I think trusting God for some people feels like, well, I'm just not going to feel like that. No, we're definitely going to feel like that. So if the more, and but the more that you can cut that off and kind of return back to those places that here's what I know, here's what my past experiences have been, here's what I've seen him do in other people's lives. Those are the places I think where those are the steps, constantly to celebrating that, not forgetting it and saying, hey, I couldn't see it here. And now I saw a glimpse of it again. I just don't want anybody to walk away feeling like, well, I just shouldn't feel like that. Like, well, on the daily, hello.
Yeah, totally.
Like me,
You're
I
gonna try.
do,
You're gonna
totally. So
that's good.
Yeah.
That's so good. So we trust, we follow, and then like you said, Ben, we celebrate, we anticipate, even in the midst of those little moments where we're leading up to that big miracle, we see God working, which is so important for us to do. And then when a miracle does happen, it's like we have to acknowledge it, right? Like just speaking it and just saying, man, this was so cool. Look what God did. I think there's studies done that people who practice gratitude daily live just better quality lives. And I think this last point of celebrating is just so important. And even the small things.
Yeah, and it might not turn out the way that you wanted it to. In fact, most of the time it doesn't. So how can we get ourselves in this posture of seeing those moments, recognizing that we can't always see the whole picture. So just what you were saying.
I mean, back to Lori's example or Shortridge's example, right? Like even something as simple as writing down all of the little things that we're grateful for, and we saw God work and we saw miracles happen along the way.
Yeah.
Just really, really good things to be doing.
Yeah.
Any other last thoughts on those 3 steps? So we're gonna trust.
We're going to trust.
We're going to follow. And we're going to celebrate. And we're going to experience miracles, right?
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
That's right.
Yeah. We do already. His grace is like, right?
I know, right?
Every day.
Yeah, that's so good.
Every day.
So for you listening, here's a practical, I guess, takeaway. And we can talk through this a little bit too. I think for a lot of us, we may be identifying or thinking through a moment or a struggle we're experiencing right now. We want a miracle. We want God to work in a way that we can't work. So first of all, good job. That's your first step, is to identify that.
Yep.
I would encourage you, take some time this week and pray over that. Acknowledge with God that this is something I'm struggling with. This is something I'm asking for you to work in a way that I know that I can't. Trusting that, making that initial turn, saying, God, this is yours. So maybe that's your first step. Maybe you've done that already. Maybe you've given that to God. I would encourage you to find the people around you who are following Jesus with you and talk to them. Sit across the table with them. Get coffee with them. Text them right now. Pull over if you're driving. Text them right now and say, hey, can we get coffee? I want to talk through this.
Yep.
Because it's so important, and we've all experienced this too. It's so important to have people in your life who are encouraging you along the way as you're trying to experience the miracles that God has for you.
Yep.
So I would say those 2 steps. And then as you move through the process, if you're maybe in the middle of it right now, maybe you are trusting God and you are surrounding yourself with people.
That's right.
Take time and celebrate. Be grateful. Reflect on the things that God is doing in the midst of that. Again, it can be little things. It can be the interaction you had with your neighbor lady because you were running a little bit late to a doctor's appointment. Again, it could be anything. Those little moments, God is trying to use you and work through you. So those are some practical takeaways, some ways to, if you will, live it out throughout the week, because this is the Living It Out podcast, right? I want to give you some practical ways.
After all.
Yes, absolutely. Marna, Ben, any other closing thoughts before we kind of kick it off?
No, I just think, I was thinking in a little bit we're going to be talking about baptism and just the celebration of life change. And life change really is a miracle as well.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about that miracle that I think I was thinking about this through celebration. It was that expectation. And a lot of times we're coming together as a weekend, dream teams. And we want people to come in the door and learn about Jesus and experience life change, which is a miracle. And do we expect that? Do we expect on the weekends that people are going to be coming in, they're going to hear a message, and then miraculously their life change is going to be changed because of God's grace?
Yes.
So I was just thinking about
that's a miracle.
That's a miracle. Every weekend we have an opportunity to be a part of a miracle. And participate in God's grace plan for these people. So
that's good.
And then this weekend, as we step into week 1 of the month, is Growth Track, and then also baptisms. And those people who are taking the step of being baptized are really evidence that God's really, there's miracles happening each and every week here at Cedar Creek.
It's great. Growth Track baptisms this weekend.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it. It's going to be a party.
Yes,
it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you haven't gone through Growth Track yet, this is a great weekend to start. I'd encourage you to just show up. Whatever your campus details are, you can check with your campus pastor, Next Steps director, and they'll have your details for you at your campus. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in, for listening to this week's podcast. We hope you were encouraged, and we hope that you live this week like you matter, because you do. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you guys next week.